For more on the situation in Libya, we are joined via satellite by Akuetteh, the former executive director of African Action. He is in Washington, D.C., and also Ayo Johnson, director of Viewpoint Africa, now in London. Also here in Beijing, we have Professor Rong from China Institute of International Studies. Welcome to you all, gentlemen. First question I want to address really to the three of you. How would you see the sequence of events? Earlier, rebels in Libya rejected the African Union's suggestion and roadmap and demanding the remove of Gaddafi or leave of Gaddafi. And later, we heard from President Obama, Prime Minister Cameron, and also President Sarkozy, the same demand. How do you see the sequence of the events? Mr. Rong first, very briefly.
Oh, indeed. I think we see a lot of sort of discussions about the sequence or the next step, and again the background that it's clear that there are no military solution. The political solution is the only way out. But it seems that the coalition and the West in particular is putting some preconditions. That is, say, the ouster of Gaddafi, which I don't think is a good idea.
Mr. Akuetteh from Washington, D.C.
Yes. I think that the idea that Mr. Gaddafi will stay, for me, is a big problem. So I side with those who are saying that he must go. Yes, it is true that the three Western leaders, Obama, Sarkozy, and Cameron, have both said he must go. But we must not also forget that in the meeting last week in the Middle East, the new contact group also said he must go because he's been there 42 years. He has shown that he's very brutal, doesn't want to talk to anybody. I don't see how you can have an inclusive government dominated by him. So I do agree that he needs to leave. Now the question is whether the war should continue or whether there should be a ceasefire.
I think the sequence of events in Libya shows that Mr. Gaddafi has got to go. Clearly he's been in power for a very long time, but the concerns are very much about the coalition. The coalition is struggling to stay intact simply because the conflict has been taking on so long, and each day that goes by public opinion changes, very much so locally and internationally. And I think this is very much a battle of hearts and minds as much as it is to change and implement democracy in Gaddafi's rule. So I personally think that the consensus internationally is the one that's going to dictate, and that's why the coalition is struggling and calling for more people to join the NATO strikes and for more equipment, more bombs, and of course they're also having difficulty distinguishing between Gaddafi's men and the rebels on the ground, simply because Gaddafi has changed the type of equipment, and especially that of the pickup trucks that are on the ground. So when you're 60,000 feet above the ground level, it's difficult to distinguish who you're shooting at.
Right, Mr. Johnson, you said earlier that the international community is demanding the step down of Mr. Gaddafi. I'm not sure about that, though, because earlier, as you may have heard in our report, the BRICS countries, at least, with the latest statement they put in the Sanya Declaration, they're asking all sides to put down their arms, no military intervention either. They didn't ask the step down of Colonel Gaddafi. Right?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Britain, France, and the United States recently requested that regime change was on the cards, but nonetheless, Brazil, China, India, and a few other countries have actually expressed concerns and have asked for a ceasefire. But again, because the expectation levels are so high, especially from the rebels, it's going to be difficult as to how that can actually play on the ground.
Mr. Akuetteh, earlier, Mr. Johnson mentioned the expectation of the rebels. So here is the question. Is the expectation of the rebels should be the rules of the game, or the international rules should be the rule of the game? Mr. Akuetteh.
I think really you have to look at both, because both groups that you cited, the rebels and the international community, They are both stakeholders. They are role players. The rebels alone cannot do it. They've been asking for a lot of help. Even with all the help they've gotten from the no-fly zone and the bombings, they are still not winning the fight decisively. So they need the international community. On the other hand, the international community also needs the rebels. So I think the viewpoint of both and the positions and demands of both have to be taken into account. Now, I am not...
Before you continue, Mr. Akuetteh, may I just interrupt a little bit and let you clear up exactly what is the term international community you're referring to? Are you referring to the Western coalition who are bombing Libya? Or are you referring to the international community, as we say, being members of the UN, United Nations, or being members of the UN Security Council?
Of course, you've got me there because that's a very flexible term. In my answer,
well,
I was thinking...
so flexible if we were making a statement, right?
That's correct, but let me say what I meant when I was talking about the international community. I meant even the BRIC countries who just had the summit. I meant the Gulf Cooperation Council. I meant the International Contact Group. I even meant the Africa Union.
All right, here is the question.
Outside Libya.
All right, here is the question, Mr. Akuetteh, if I could follow up. Many have been arguing, though many disagree, many have been arguing as well, that the demanding of stepping down of Colonel Gaddafi, whose government is still being recognized by the United Nations, is going beyond the mandate of the UN Security Council Resolution 1973 and 1974. What is your opinion?
Oh, my opinion is that, strictly speaking, they are right, because the UN resolutions did not ask for Mr. Gaddafi to leave. They just gave a mandate for protection of civilians. However, if you just protect civilians, it doesn't solve the problem. We know that to get any resolution through the UN, even the smaller group as the Security Council, a lot of compromises have to be made. So the resolutions that have come out were compromises, and they did not ask for Mr. Gaddafi to be removed. But if you leave him in power, it is going to create a lot of problems. As Mr. Johnson pointed out, he's been using banned armament. So this is a person who's been in power for more than 40 years, kills his own people. So the UN resolution, in my view, was not sufficient. So we have to look down the road.
Okay, Mr. Rong.
Yes, I think what we are talking about is what would the sequence, what would happen the first, or what will happen the next, or the third. I think the put in the condition that the removal of Gaddafi was not good for the sort of beginning for the political settlement, because it would complicate the whole process. I think obviously there are a lot of questions when you talk about the removal of Gaddafi. I mean, where is it going? How is it going? How is it going to happen? And what happened to his his families and other so on and so forth? Given in the fact that there are UN security resolutions about the ICC issues. So what I argue, and what I believe the BRICS the position is that, first, let's get the start of that political process. For that to happen, you need to have the immediate ceasefire, which means that it have to put pressure both on the government of Libya, the Gaddafi Gaddafi in particular, regime in particular, and also the rebels. So when that happens, when the ceasefire sort of put into implemented, then we can talk about a lot of possibilities.
All right.
I mean, whether the Gaddafi is going to leave or stay, or who is going to take over and so on.
But Mr. Rong, many would argue with you as to what would be the means to let everybody put down their arms. What would be the means to lead everybody to the peace talk or to the negotiations?
That is a very good question, but I think that got to be, it would not be answered unless the coalition, the international coalition, in particular the West, started to agree that a ceasefire should proceed to the discussions and debate about where or whether and how Gaddafi should go.
But given Mr. Johnson in London, the complicated situation, not only between those who are pro-military intervention or who are against the intervention, but also within the pro-group, let's say, the Western coalition starting the bombing. There are so much divisions as to who should play a leading role, whether the United States, whether the NATO, or who should seek an asylum place or asylum country for Colonel Gaddafi if he ever willing to step down, all of these things. So would there be any agreement among the pro-group, let's say, to make a decision so that the next step can follow up? As you may know, the situation inside Libya is changing dramatically every day.
Absolutely. The concern for the coalition currently is how to keep the coalition from disintegrating. That's one, because at the moment the mandate is being stretched to the extent that the actions on the ground do not fit the mandate itself, so they've got to go back to the drawing board and get another mandate. That in itself will be very, very difficult in the UN to do so. You have some countries who are prepared to do it unilaterally. Again, there are elements of concerns because they've learned from some of the experiences that in Afghanistan, Iraq, and most recently in Somalia, where military conflicts have taken a wrong route, have extended far longer than one would have wished, and have cost millions of dollars. So I think the element of financial implications are very much in their minds, and very much how they can maintain the campaign in the medium to long term, because these campaigns, with all the good intentions in starting them off, there's always the lack of an exit plan, and very much the lack of an understanding of tribal imbalances, cultural issues, and very much how the country as a whole governs and how it functions. And when you do not have those sort of pure understanding, then you can have all sorts of complexities which could extend far longer than you otherwise
That's only
wish.
one part of complexity we're talking about. The other part of complexity, Mr. Akuetteh, is who exactly the rebels are. According to the recent LA Times story, some of the rebel leaders actually were under the protection of Al-Qaeda. They had met with bin Laden, and they were also the enemies of the United States, and even were working to build a branch of Al-Qaeda inside the United States. How do we see the complexity within the phenomenon of so-called rebels?
That's an excellent question and an excellent point. Of course, it's a very diverse group. It should not surprise us that, you know, Libya is both an African country and has an Arab culture. And as we know, this Al-Qaeda has drawn its support because it felt that United States policy for decades have been targeting the Middle East. So it should not surprise us that there are some people who are both Libyans and also have either fought for Al-Qaeda or are sympathizers. This question has been debated in the US a lot, but to me it's not a surprise. There are some of them there. The question is, how many are there? The most important issue is these are Libyan citizens who are being killed by Colonel Gaddafi. Colonel Gaddafi, if he wanted a peaceful resolution, we can be done.
We have to wrap it up for your. We have to wrap it up for your remarks. But Mr. Rong, 10 seconds for you. 10 seconds only.
Well, I thought that all the previous speakers made a very good point. That is, I think at this critical moment, what we need at the most is the international community, a kind of consensus, which I think for the past 1 month, because of the division, because of the different interpretation of the mandate, now we have becoming less and less. And you know, looking ahead, I mean, we really need that kind of consensus for the final
it's always a
settlement.
heated debate when it comes to the issue of Libya. I want to thank the three gentlemen, Rong, Ying, Ayo Johnson, and Akuetteh. Thank you. Thank you very much. From Saturday to Monday, Cuba is convening its Communist Party